So just a big round of applause for Dr. Mary Ruwart, please.
Well, thank you all, and if you have problems here, of course, let me know. So, I'm going to be talking today about death by regulation. That's because a lot of people believe that if you don't have regulation, you're going to have problems, big problems. And in fact, it's just the opposite. Most regulation actually kills us, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to focus on the US FDA, but what I say is going to apply to the regulatory agency in every single country that regulates pharmaceuticals. But before I get into that, I just want to mention a couple other studies that have been done. So you know that this idea that regulation kills is not just limited to what I'm going to talk about today, you know, what my big talk is about. You know, in the United States, of course, we have 50 states, which is really good because it's like 50 little laboratories where all the states make different regulations. And so you can compare things across states. And one of the studies that was done quite some time ago showed, for example, that in states that had more rigorous regulation for the licensing of electricians, those states also had more accidental electrocutions. Why? Well, because if you have regulations that cost a lot of money and time to get, there are fewer electricians, so they can charge more money. And it's a supply and demand thing, right? So the people who are poor, when they have an electrical problem, are afraid because they don't want to give a big bill for an electrician to come in. So they oftentimes try to do the repair themselves, and they electrocute themselves in the process. So it's important to know that there are effects, what we might call unseen effects at first, for regulations. And the reason I'm going to focus on the FDA and the equivalent in other countries today is because that's where I believe that we'll find most of the deaths. So, and the reason I'm going to be talking about the United States FDA is that, as you probably know, what happens in the US tends to ripple out to other countries. And there is a movement afoot to harmonize all of the regulatory bodies that work on pharmaceutical drugs. They want everybody to have the same regulations. And that would be fine maybe if they wanted fewer regulations, but they want more. And so what I'm talking to you about today is coming to your country in the near future if things don't stop, if we can't explain to people how these regulations actually harm them. Now, because of course the meeting is in Colombia, I've put the name of the Colombia FDA equivalent up on the slide, and it's been around since 1992, whereas the US FDA has been around really since the beginning of the 20th century. So, especially in developing countries. Because I'm going to explain how these regulations, at least in the US, have shaved 5 to 10 years off each of our lives. And because what happens in the US does ripple outward, it's probably affected your country as well. So the big change in the FDA happened in 1962 with what we call the Kefauver-Harris amendments. It gave the FDA a lot of power over pharmaceuticals. It tells drug manufacturers what animal studies they need to do, what human studies they need to do. It tells them what advertising they can do. The label that comes with the bottle, they control that. They oversee the manufacturing of drugs. And maybe one of the most important things that happened in 1962 was that someone at the FDA had to actually sign on the dotted line, yes, I think we should all of their data to the FDA. And if the FDA did not object to that data, after 6 months, the companies could market their drug. So this law in 1962 actually meant that somebody in the FDA had to put their neck in the proverbial noose. And then if something went wrong with the drug, Congress would have someone to point to and blame. So this made the FDA very risk averse. They didn't really want to approve many drugs because every time they approved a drug, they risked having Congress get upset with them because every drug has side effects. And because of that, it was only a matter of time before the finger would be pointed at the FDA examiners that signed off on the approvals. Now, another thing that's very important to note about these regulations is they aren't set in stone. They aren't a one-time thing. They're open-ended, which means they grow every year. Because of the way the law was set up, every year the FDA can add more and more and more. And so what eventually happened is these amendments so empowered the FDA that it really reshaped the pharmaceutical industry. It redefined medical practice and shifted our medical paradigm in the US from prevention to treatment. And that last item is probably the most deadly thing that was done. As we'll see, those first three things probably shaved about 5 years off each of our lives in the US. But I think that we lost another 5 years because of the shift from prevention to treatment. And I'll show you how I figured that out and what we can do about it. So, the first thing I want to point out is that before the amendments, if you looked at the years that it took a drug to get from the lab bench to the marketplace, you'll see in these blue boxes that it took roughly 4 years. So that was not too bad. But after the amendments, it started creeping up until it ended up around 14 years. Well, as you might imagine, that meant a lot of people died waiting. And in fact, when I was working on AIDS for the Upjohn Company, what we found is that the AIDS patients had already figured out that they couldn't wait 14 years. They would be dead. So what they started doing is they hired black market chemists to make the same drugs we were working on in the pharmaceutical industry. And they distributed them throughout the country to any AIDS patient that wanted them. So but by the time the FDA finally gave the drug companies permission to test in people, every AIDS patient in the country who wanted that treatment had already had it, and of course were resistant to it. So the pharmaceutical companies had to wait until people were newly diagnosed with AIDS and tried to enroll them in their clinical trials. And if you saw the award-winning movie Dallas Buyers Club, you saw how the FDA prosecuted and persecuted some of these AIDS patients that formed buyers clubs in order to distribute not only the drugs that were being studied in the pharmaceutical industry, but drugs from overseas and some nutritional supplements that they thought would help them. And basically what the FDA did is, in Texas, where I currently live, they really focused a lot of their prosecution efforts because in Texas, they were not part of the AIDS patients weren't part of the media. Let me get rid of those chimes, sorry about that. And in California, where the AIDS patients were very highly connected to the media, they didn't bother with it because they knew there'd be a big media blow-up and everyone would understand that the FDA was actually prosecuting and persecuting very sick people. Now, because you're libertarians, I know you're thinking, well, if we went from 4 years to over 14 years, the cost of getting an FDA approval must have gone up. And you're right, it did. If you look at this graph, what you're seeing is the research and development costs per what we call an NCE, or new chemical entity, a new drug. Think of it as a new drug. And if you look at the different decades in the last part of the century and early part of the 21st, what you see with these black squares is the cost of getting this FDA approval is going up exponentially. Whereas before the amendments, it was more linear. Now, this is not a perfect extrapolation, but these numbers are pretty solid. So the FDA can increase the number of studies every year. You can see it reflected here in the cost. And again, because you understand markets, you're probably saying, well, if costs are going up, surely prices are too. And of course, you'd be right. Because here we see the average cost of a branded prescription drug, which is a new drug, versus the cost. Here I've capitalized it because we have a long period of time for the development, 12 to 14 years. And so you have to kind of factor in the cost of getting that money to do the research before you get a payoff. And you can see there's a pretty tight correlation between what we spend at the pharmacy here in the US and the cost of getting the FDA approval. The bottom line is that if pre-amendment trends had continued, pharmaceutical prices in the US would probably be about 5 to 10% of what they are today. So that's a pretty high price to pay for these regulations. And, if it improves safety, we might be okay with that, but in fact, it doesn't. But before I get into that, I'd like to show you that there's a lot of people who die waiting, just like the AIDS patients were afraid that they would do. And here, I've calculated the lives lost due to these amendment-driven development delays. When we go from 4 years to 14, 12 to 14 years. And we can make this calculation on a decade basis because we know how many new drugs were approved in which decade. We know the mean development time for these decades. And of course, we know what it used to be. So we can calculate the extra years. And there's been studies on how many lives or life years that the current drugs that are on the market actually save. And so bottom line, when you come out to about 15 million Americans have died between 1963 and 2009, just because they're waiting for life-saving drugs. Now to really get a good fix on that is more people that have died in the US from these delays, all the wars that the US has been engaged in up until this time, including the American Revolution. So that's a pretty huge number of people. And again, if there was really more safety, maybe the trade-off would be there, but in fact, all of the things that we can look at indicate that the drugs in the US are, if anything, less safe than they were prior to the amendments, and we'll talk about why that is in a minute. So, for example, many drugs are approved by the FDA, and they go out into the marketplace, and then they're found to have some very bad side effects. So before the amendments were passed, about 2.5% of all the drugs that were FDA approved were eventually taken off the market for safety reasons. But after the amendments, that number went up to 3.3%. Now that number might not really be all that different from the 2.5%, but as you can see, it's going in the wrong direction. If the amendments actually made drugs safer, which is what a lot of people believe about regulations, that they make us more safe, that number should have gone down dramatically, and it did not. Like I said, it was in the wrong direction. And in the US, the biggest drug disasters really happened after the passage of the amendments. In the US, we did not have a thalidomide tragedy. Europe did, and they had about 10,000 deformities with babies. For those of you who don't know what thalidomide is, it's a drug that started out as a safer sleeping pill, safer than barbiturates, which killed a lot of people at that time. And women started taking it because it also helped with morning sickness. The problem was if they took it at a particular time in the pregnancy, the child could be born deformed or without limbs. So this was a big tragedy, and actually it didn't happen in the US because the FDA already had the power to stop a drug that they didn't feel good about, and they actually did stop thalidomide, not because it had a problem with the babies, but because it had some other side effects that the FDA felt uncomfortable with. So we never even had that in the US. So, we did not have a big problem in the US at the time these amendments were passed, but Europe did. And these amendments, in part, were passed because some Americans were afraid that maybe our FDA wasn't empowered enough. So the FDA eventually started charging user fees for their drugs. User fees really meant that if you wanted your drug approved rapidly, you would pay this fee. The FDA would hire more examiners, and your drug would be approved faster. And that was about a year faster, which is an important amount, but still, obviously, the other 13 years, of course, were still a problem, but that's because the FDA demanded a lot of studies so that they didn't get into trouble with Congress. So when Vioxx came along, some people in the FDA knew that it probably caused heart attacks, but the person who was really pushing not to approve Vioxx went to his supervisor, and the supervisor said, no, with all these user fees, the pharmaceutical industry is our client. So if they want to put this drug out, we're going to do it. And consequently, it was later had to be taken off the market because it caused, and these are the FDA's numbers. These are probably low. 140,000 heart attacks and 60,000 deaths. So that was our biggest drug snafu here in the US. Now you might ask, how can you do 10 more years of studies and not have increased safety? Well, the reason is that most safety issues before the amendments were passed and today have the same issue. Our science just is not good enough to detect every problem that there is with drugs. It just isn't. And sometimes there's going to be a drug that makes it through the marketing process, and then when we give it to many, many people, we find out that it's really not so good. And, as of course our science gets better, 100 years from now, maybe we'll be able to whittle that down. But right now, our science just isn't good enough. It wasn't good enough before the amendments, and it isn't good enough after the amendments. So there are going to always be some drugs that get through that have safety issues that we wish we hadn't put on the market. That's where we are today. Now, I talked about the deaths that occurred because of the delays in development that don't protect us from unsafe drugs, and in fact, in some ways, kind of predispose us to unsafe drugs, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. But a bigger problem is the loss of information. If the manufacturers have to spend all their money jumping through regulatory hoops for an extra 10 years, and these regulatory hoops don't give us any more safety, then that's very costly, and they can't work on doing research to find new drugs. How much innovation do we lose? Well, there are studies that show there's at least a 50% loss in what we call late-stage development. What that means is the manufacturers have spent maybe 10 years trying to get all this hoop jumping, regulatory hoop jumping done. But then they realize, wait, even if we get FDA approval, we're going to lose money on this drug. And so they stop developing it. But I think this number is small. I think it's probably closer to 80%, and that's because drug companies try to predict how much money they're going to have to spend in development, and they stop and don't even start, I should say, a lot of development. And I'm going to tell you a personal story about that. One of the FDA examiners actually called me up and said, Dr. Ruwart, we understand that you filed for a patent for prostaglandins and liver disease. I said, yes, that's true. They said, we want to help you get this to market because there isn't anything for prostaglandins and liver disease. And of course, being young and naive, I thought that would speed the process along. But the fact was, the FDA still had these hoops you had to jump through. And when you actually are able, or think you're able, to cure a new disease, there's a lot of unknowns. So, for example, you don't know, we didn't know how much prostaglandin we had to give in each dose. We didn't know how many doses we need to give. We didn't know how long we had to treat patients because liver disease develops over time. Probably it would take some time to have it reversed. And what we quickly realized is if we didn't guess right on all of these things the first time, we do the studies, which take years. And then if we didn't have the statistical significance that the FDA demanded, we'd have to start over. And if we did that, almost for sure, our drug would be off patent by the time we got to market. It would go generic immediately, and we'd never ever be able to recover our development costs. So we decided not to do it, even though there's been some publications since then that suggest it probably would have worked. So it's very important to realize that a lot of companies have cures for diseases that they never develop, simply because they know they can't recover their costs, and the costs are going up every year. So if you make some assumptions that the drugs that we don't have anymore, and let's use 50%, right? Not the 80% I think it really is. So these lost drugs, if they're only 25% as effective as the ones currently on the market, we're talking about almost 27 million people dying prematurely because of loss of innovation. And if you take the number and work it, what it means is that each of us have lost 5 years of our lives to these regulations. And in your country, it's probably the same because, a lot of, especially in the developing world, if a drug is approved in another country like the US, then they approve it too, but if not, they don't. So since half the innovation is happening in the US, means that innovation is lost to every country in the world. But I told you I thought it was closer to 10 years, and that's because of the shift from prevention to treatment. So let me give you some examples here from my personal experience. First of all, I was in the industry before all this genetic manipulation was possible. So when we wanted a model of disease, we were having a lot of trouble because our rats were very healthy. And that's because we had titrated their diet to make sure they had all the vitamins and minerals and things that they needed to be healthy, so they just didn't get sick. So the way we made them sick is depending on the disease we wanted to create. We took away one of their vitamins. For example, in liver disease, we took away their choline, which is a B vitamin. And then they developed liver disease that looked very similar to some of the things we see in humans. Well, of course, if you do this enough, you realize, wait a minute, optimal nutrition is what we need in order to be disease-free, or at least have less disease. And so when all the things about nutrients are suppressed, and I'll tell you why they are in a minute, then you have a problem, because you don't have people taking optimal nutrition. Why are they suppressed? Well, one of the things about the 1962 amendments is that you can't market a drug in the US unless you have jumped through those 14 years of regulatory hoops. You can't say, this vitamin will prevent you from getting this disease, or this vitamin will cure this disease, unless you go through those 14 years of hoop jumping. Now, the problem is vitamins and nutrients are not patentable, or they're off patent, which means the patent has expired. So nobody's going to spend 14 years and those billions of dollars, what is it, two and a half right now, to develop a drug that they can't recover their costs from. And so, because of these amendments, the FDA has gone to really a number of farmers even who have grown like walnuts and shut them down because they're talking about the nutrients in their walnuts and how healthy that can make you, and that's not allowed here in the US. So consequently, we end up developing drugs when we could use nutrients instead. I was on a plane one time, and the man next to me said, "Hey, I understand your company we're working on these drugs called Lazaroids." And we had named them that because, basically after the biblical Lazarus, who was raised from the dead, because these things were so potent. And he wanted some, but since they were in development, we don't normally give those out. But I did talk to the project manager, and he said, well, just tell him to take lots of vitamin E. It'll do the same thing. So why are we giving vitamin E? Why aren't we giving vitamin E, I should say? Well, we aren't selling it or giving it out because we can't say in the US that the vitamin E will help with these conditions. Because if we do, if we want to say that, we need to jump through those 14 years of regulatory hoops. And I could go on, I have this big list here, as you can see. I'm going to go just through a couple. The B vitamin, folic acid, is known to prevent birth defects, specifically neural tube defects, such as spina bifida. And the thing is, the young woman needs to be taking these vitamins if she even dreams of being pregnant, because she has to have them the first month or two of pregnancy, when a lot of women don't even know that they're pregnant. And in the US, the FDA forbade the folic acid manufacturers from telling American women, hey, it's a good idea to take this. Couldn't do it. Folic acid manufacturers were told they'd be sued if they said anything like that. Well, this was in the early 1980s. In 1992, the CDC, Center for Disease Control, another government agency, started making that recommendation, and the FDA told the folic acid manufacturers that if they even mentioned the CDC's recommendation, they would shut them down. So consequently, here in the US, women kept having babies with birth defects that could have been prevented. And in other countries, in Europe, for example, in many cases, the government actually encouraged this kind of advertising and paid for a lot of it themselves. So that's kind of crazy. And, that's another example of how we have harmed our systems and have lost lives, because instead of prevention, which we can't really have in the way we used to, we have to rely on treatment. And then, of course, there are cases where the nutrients are so important, such as fish oil, that the manufacturer will take the fish oil ingredient, put an extra chemical group on it that your body takes off, and then jump through the 14 years of hoops, because now they can patent this strange compound and they can make money on it. And of course, what that means is that the drug is extremely expensive compared to over-the-counter fish oil. My sister had a medical condition that qualified for treatment with fish oil, but she found out for the same price of her copay and insurance, she could actually buy fish oil that was even purer and better than the drug that the FDA had approved. So she never got the prescription fish oil. Well, I could go on, but I do want to make sure we have time for questions. So I'm going to just go to the conclusion. And the conclusion is that the side effects of regulation can be just as deadly and often more widespread than side effects from pharmaceutical drugs. This is an important thing for us to know as libertarians, and we need to be able to demonstrate it. The good news about this is that if we are regulators, pharmaceutical executive, elected official of the public, whoever we are, we're all affected by these kinds of regulations that impact on our health. So if Congress knew that their lives were being shortened by these regulations, don't you think they might do something about it? We have a better chance of changing that than we do of some other regulations which don't affect our lawmakers. So in some ways, I'm optimistic. It can happen. I think change is possible. The thing is, we have to appeal to their own self-interest and show them that they are only harming themselves with these regulations. And if you want to know more about this, you can check out my book, Death by Regulation, which is available on Amazon and also at my website, ruwart.com. When we released it, we had a little bit of time when we were an Amazon bestseller in 3 countries, and are quite proud of that. So I'm going to open it up to questions, and I want to thank you for your attention, and thank you for letting me be here and address you today.
Thank you very much.